Hello, everyone. It's 9:30, 9:30 my time, 8:30 Pacific time, and I think we'll get started. I'm Rhonda Miller. I'm the moderator for this session, and this is the Pasture and Rangeland breakout session for our Regional Nutrient Cycling, Soil Health, and Food Safety Conference. Just a couple little bits of housekeeping before we start. We ask that everybody remain muted during the presentations and during the live question and answer session so that it doesn't get to be too noisy in the background and difficult for people to hear. Please use the chat box for any questions that you may have, and we will have time for those at the end of the presentation. We have asked each of our presenters to provide a video. So I'll be playing the video on my end. That was just to help minimize glitches as we transfer back and forth. Our presenters are with us and they will be able to answer your questions live. So we'll pull the questions out of the chat box and they'll be able to respond live for you today at the end of the presentation. At the very end of the session, we will have a poll. It's really short, 3 simple little questions. We ask that you please complete that. And if you're joining us and wanting CEU credits, the QR code will be provided at the end of the session. If you need a paper copy, the information, you can email me and I'll send you a paper form to fill out. And with that, I think we'll get started. So Tibor Horvath is our first presenter. He'll be talking about manure applications, impact on runoff, soil erosion, and nutrient transport. He's with NRCS, and this is a joint venture.
Hi, my name is Tibor Horvath. I'm working for USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service at the East National Technology Support Center. This is the National Animal Manure and Nutrient Management Team, where I'm serving as an agronomist. This presentation is covering a joint research was done between my agency and ARS National Soil Dynamic Lab. The research was about manure applications' impact on runoff, soil erosion, and nutrient transport of farm fields. On this first slide on the left, you can see the traditional rainfall simulator. That was a 1.5 by 2 meter plot, and one rainfall simulator had to be carried out to the field, and was kind of cumbersome to set up to capture runoff from the rainfall simulation. So we decided to try this new invention, this 5-pan rainfall simulator developed by University of Nebraska and manufactured and distributed by Conservation Demonstrations LLC in Salina, Kansas. This unit can generate 5 data sets. So you have 5 soil samples, you can have different manure applications, different soil types, and you can capture infiltration and runoff with one rainfall simulation. And you can analyze the effluent from the runoff to see nutrient content and sediment content. First of all, you have to calibrate this unit to make sure that all 5 pan receiving the same amount of rainfall, and should not be more than 50 milliliter difference between the soil pans. We collected the soil samples for the rainfall simulation experiments from North Carolina A&T University Farm. On this field, 29B has a long-term no-till practice on it and have cover crop every winter, so the soil had a decent soil health and good soil quality. We utilized this soil sample extractor tool developed by Conservation Demonstrations LLC. This enables you to cut out a soil sample without fractures, so you would not have preferential flows in the soil sample when you conduct a rainfall simulation. On the right, you can see on the truck we just collected 15 soil samples from the very same location of the field. So the soil characteristics are very same, and we made sure that there was no fracture, no preferential flows, and we made sure that the surface cover was mimicking what was on the field. So after we collected the 15 soil sample, we ran the rainfall simulator, and based on the results, we selected 3 group of 5 soil samples. They had the most similar infiltration and runoff characteristics. So this way we can make sure that the differences in the future rainfall simulations will be caused only by the different manure application rates and different manure types. On the next slide, you can see the picture of field 29B, and I have here the current soil analysis report. This is North Carolina Department of Agricultural Soil Lab. They're reporting a PI, so I figured out that 89 PI means 230 pounds per acre P2O5 soil test. So you can see it's very high on phosphorus. The reason is because this farm using a lot of manure applications. They have poultry, swine, dairy manure applied, and also they have seasonal grazing. In winter time they will graze a cover crop, so there is manure deposited from the cows also. So that explains the high soil test phosphorus on this field. For the first series of rainfall simulations, we used solid dairy manure. This is originated from North Carolina A&T University dairy farm. And you can see here the manure separation facility. This is the gravitational manure separation facility. They use sawdust bedding in a freestyle area, and then they push out the manure into this facility, then pile up the manure about 6 foot high, and the gravitation will separate the liquid, and the liquid portion will flow out on the back of this facility through a weep hole into an in-ground circular concrete pit. So the solid dairy manure we collected from this facility. The solid dairy manure we collected from the top of the pile. It was measured in the laboratory to be 19.6 dry matter content, and the liquid portion we collected from the in-ground liquid storage pit, that was 4.3% dry matter content. The next slide is showing the weep holes on the back of the manure separation facility. They take the manure into this circular concrete in-ground pit, which has a pump in it. So when we were collecting the liquid manure for the experiments, it was during the agitation time, so we had a good representative sample, and we used this for the manure application experiments. And here is the next slide showing the manure analysis report for the solid dairy manure, and we had typical values in nitrogen, P2O5 and potassium on this report. So this is the manure we use for the first series of experiments applying to these long-term no-till soil samples and doing the rainfall simulation experiments. On the next slide, I'm showing you the different rate manure applications. So we replicated 5, 10, 15 and 20 tons per acre solid dairy manure applications to the long-term no-till soil samples. So we had 3 replications of each sample, and this way we could run the rainfall simulator and see the differences in runoff, infiltration and nutrient contents of the runoff effluent. On this next slide, you can see the setup of the rainfall simulator with 5 soil samples. So on the left is the control with no manure application. Then we have the 5, 10, 15, 20 tons per acre solid dairy manure applied to the soil samples. And we have 3 sets of samples to can replicate the rainfall simulations. We did wait a week after manure application to conduct the first rainfall simulation. Then we repeated the rainfall simulation with 1 week after. So we had a total of 3 rainfall simulations. We had 1 week in between. The soil samples with the manure were stored on the roofed area out of direct sunlight or rainfall, so we had no impact from the environment. This slide actually showing one of the rainfall simulation right after we finished. So we apply 1 inch rainfall in 15-minute duration. That correlates about a 5-year storm peak, the storm event. So that's a pretty significant storm, and so we can see we can collect the runoff and also the infiltration on the rear bottles. Then we take the effluent samples from the runoff, send it to the lab, and we also filter out the sediments to measure sediment detachment from each samples. All these rainfall simulation experiments were done outside. You can see on the left photo how we filtered out the sediments from each runoff bottle. We used a filter cloth we found that was a little bit faster. And with the filter cloud, we could send the samples into the lab to dry and measure the amount of sediments from each runoff effluent. On the right, you can see the virals. We sent in the runoff effluent for nutrient analysis. We checked for ammonium nitrogen, nitrate nitrogen, and dissolved phosphorus. Actually, I included this table in here, the average of the 3 rainfall simulation results from the solid dairy manure applications to long-term no-till soils. And the sediment detachment correlates to a very low amount of soil loss. This is a long-term no-till soil, and with the heavy solid manure application, the soil loss was really minimal. You can see the nutrient content of the runoff effluent. They were kind of linearly increasing. With the more manure application, we had higher nitrate and dissolved phosphorus levels in the runoff effluent. Our second series of manure application experiments, we utilized conventionally tilled soil samples from a dairy farm. This is a dairy farm that is disking every spring for corn silage seedbed preparation. So you can see the soil is very poor quality, low soil health, and very low soil organic matter content. So we wanted to see the difference if we apply liquid manure. What are the impacts on soil loss if we have conventional tilled soil versus long-term no-till soil? And that's why we utilize this for the liquid manure application, so we have a good comparison between the two types of soil. On this slide is the soil nutrient analysis report for that conventional tilled soil from the dairy farm. You can see the very high potassium level in the soil. That's the proper result of the frequent and high level of manure applications. On this next slide, you can see the different rate of liquid manure applications onto the conventional tilled soil. So we made a 5,000 gallon, 10,000, 15 and 20,000 gallon. This manure is kind of a heavy slurry manure with 4.3% dry matter content. It is pumpable. Actually, it is applied with a tank spreader on the farm, and you can see on a 20,000 gallon we have 100% surface cover. Even with that 15,000 gallon per acre, it completely covers the soil surface. The liquid dairy manure nutrient analysis report is showing on this slide, and the potassium level was out of range, a little bit too high, but the phosphorus and the nitrogen was probably in the range what we typically see in this kind of slurry dairy manure analysis reports. On this slide you can see the soil samples with the manure application 1 week after the manure was applied. They were stored under a roofed area, so they didn't get any rainfall or direct sunlight. But please notice the hard surface crust. That liquid manure application actually dried and created a surface crust, kind of hard. So let's see how it will respond to the rainfall simulation. This picture was taken right after the first rainfall simulation to the liquid dairy manure application samples, and we did not expect this at all. What we see on the control is okay. Yeah, we expected some runoff and sediment movement because that's conventional tilled soil, no surface cover, poor soil quality, so we okay with the control results. And the 5,000 gallon per acre, you see less runoff and little sediment, so that was good. So the manure application has benefits, reducing runoff and reducing sediment movement. But when you move to the right, to the higher manure application rates, we have very high volume of runoff and almost no infiltration. So we had to explain what is happening here. This was a surprise to all of us. So what we experiment is that this liquid manure application, a slurry manure application, developed that hard crust, and even the 1-inch rainfall simulation did not make any detachment or break up this surface crust layer. It turned shiny, kind of hydrophobic, and we were making a consultation with John Gilly from ARS, who did similar experiments and tried to figure out why we have these results. We should have seen better infiltration rate and not as much runoff. We thinking about sawdust had maybe something in it, some oil, that became hydrophobic and repelled the water and generated this high volume of runoff, and the solid crust would not break up after 1 week period of time. So we got to this slide, which is very interesting. You can see the 3 different rainfall simulations for the slurry dairy manure application experiments. They are 1 week apart, and what's interesting that the results completely turned around by the 3rd week. So what we saw on April 28, what we expected to see at the very first time, that we would have more infiltration and less runoff from a higher mineral application rate. But we saw that just only at the 3rd week. So whatever caused on the 1st week the high runoff, that hydrophobic kind of surface crust, that dissolved, and by the 3rd week we saw the results we were expecting to see. So basically it was almost zero runoff from 20,000 gallon mineral application rate sample. And then we later talk about the nutrient content of the runoff on these experiments. I generated a graph to show how this runoff volume changes over time was happening, and it's very interesting. So the control, we didn't see much difference in amount of runoff, but you can see that a 5,000 gallon per acre application, we had every week less and less runoff. 10,000 gallon the same way, we had less runoff week after week, but the higher application rate had a dramatic drop off on the amount of runoff. So there was some huge changes going on that surface crust caused by the manure application and the soil. Like I mentioned before, we wanted to have a comparison with the same type of manure application to compare runoff and soil erosion data if we have conventional tilled soil versus long-term no-till soil with good soil health. So you saw the results from the poor soil quality conventional tilled soil. So we went back to North Carolina A&T University and collected samples. This time they planted corn, and we took the soil samples between the corn rows on the same location with the same residue, so we would have the same results from each soil sample. This next slide is showing the 15 soil samples we collected from that cornfield. We saving the surface residue, so basically try to mimic exactly what was on the field. And the 15 soil samples, we did first rainfall simulation to select out those 3 groups of 5 soil samples that had the most similar infiltration and runoff characteristics, and then we applied the manure. During the first rainfall simulation, we experiment similar results, surprisingly, what we've seen for the conventional tilled soil samples with the dairy slurry manure applications. So that manure acted the same way, created a hard surface crust, and the high manure application rates generated the most amount of runoff. You can see on the 20,000 gallon bottle had a tremendous amount of runoff at the 1st week. Then at the second rainfall simulation, we see less dramatic runoff from the high volume manure application. So you can see things kind of cleared up. But the significant difference between control and 5,000 gallon is interesting. So you can see 5,000 gallon per acre, this liquid slurry manure made a huge difference in the amount of runoff, and it was helping with infiltration. If you look at the bottle behind, the highest infiltration we had actually at the 5,000 gallon per acre slurry manure application. For the third rainfall simulation, I had to move under a roofed area because it was raining, and I thought it would be funny to do a rainfall simulation during rain. So the results are not surprising now after we start the first experiments with the conventional tilled soil, that we see the least amount of runoff from the 20,000 gallon per acre manure application. So we had the same results basically, that at the first week we had the highest runoff from the high minor application, and by the third week, the third rainfall simulation, we see the least amount of runoff from the high minor applications. This was a surprise, but we learned something new. The next series of rainfall simulations, we utilized a poultry litter with 1, 2, 3, and 4 tons per acre application rate. The minnow coming from a broiler operation, they used PLT treatment to the litter. And you can see on the right of the photo, that's when we are applying the minnow, the poultry litter, using a scale and replicating the 4 ton per acre minnow application on that photo. For the poultry litter minnow application experiments, we used the same long-term no-till soil samples from North Carolina A&T University. You can see here, right after the first rainfall simulation, or actually the second rainfall simulation, the different minnow application rates, and not much of a surface cover. At the 1 ton, we would say maybe 40–50% surface cover by the poultry litter application. But we still see significant difference in the amount of runoff and infiltration just from these few tons per acre poultry litter applications. I also wanted to show you the minnow nutrient analysis report for this poultry litter, and nitrogen, nitrate, ammonia rates are typical if you compare to other poultry litter nutrient analysis reports. So nothing is outstanding. It's pretty much average what you would see from a broiler house litter analysis report. The next phase of minnow application experiments were conducted using swine slurry minnow. The minnow is coming also from North Carolina A&T University, the hog research facility. And that wasn't the least rewarding as it comes to the odor. It was kind of very unpleasant. But then we had the best results coming out from this series of experiments. You can see on this photo the results of the runoff as outstandingly beautiful. You can see the least amount of runoff from the 20,000 gallon per acre swine slurry minnow application. There was no sediment in the high minnow application rate. So it can telling you that minnow application will reduce amount of runoff and will reduce sediment detachment and soil erosion. But of course, then we have to look at the negative impacts and look at the nutrient content of the runoff effluent. What was most interesting about the swine rainfall simulations that we didn't see any difference between rainfall simulations, like we did see during the dairy slurry minnow applications. At the first week, we had the high runoff from the high minnow application rate. At the swine minnow, we did not see any problems. We saw the same results, means the least amount of runoff from the high minnow application rates. But this slurry minnow had no bedding. It was just swine minnow. So the difference probably coming from that sawdust applied as a bedding in the dairy facility. And on this slide, I'm showing you the swine slurry minnow nutrient analysis report. Please pay attention to the P2O5 level of this slurry minnow. It's extremely high, 76 pounds per 1,000 gallon. So that's outstanding. And that's why, please remember this when we look at the data on the runoff effluent nutrient content, that we did not have such an outstanding high dissolved phosphorus in the runoff. So that's very interesting. And now we get into the data analysis. So this table is comparing soil loss, runoff, nutrient content of runoff effluent, comparing the solid dairy minnow applications to liquid dairy minnow applications. The biggest reduction in soil loss or sediment detachment we see at the conventional tilled soil experiments. You can see the control had 7.4 megagram per hectare, and 20,000 gallon dairy slurry minnow really brought it down to 0.3. So that's a huge impact of minnow applications into the sediment detachment and soil erosion levels. If you look at the nitrate content of the runoff effluent, the higher mineral application rates generating higher nitrate in the runoff effluent. That's what we expected. But a lot bigger impact we see from the liquid manure application. The ammonium nitrogen went up almost 10 times compared to the control. The dissolved phosphorus is kind of linearly increasing. The higher mineral application rates producing higher dissolved phosphorus levels in the runoff effluent. There's no surprise on there, and very similar results what we've seen in previous mineral application runoff experiments. On the next slide, you can see the ammonium level changes in runoff effluent over time. That's interesting to notice the significant drop in the amount of ammonium in the runoff effluent. Just in 3-week time, the ammonium level in the runoff effluent dropped down almost a third of the first week. The nitrate level changes were different. So you see the higher mineral application rate, the nitrate increasing with time. That's what we've seen in the previous slide. At the control, you see the nitrate levels decreasing with time, but when you apply more and more manure, the nitrate levels in runoff effluent will increase with time. So there is some kind of process going on in the manure application on that soil surface, generating more and more nitrate. On the bottom of this slide, the dissolved phosphorus levels, you can see it's interesting the differences. The high manure application rate producing decreasing dissolved phosphorus in the runoff with time. When you have a lower manure application rate, also you see the decreasing, but the biggest difference we see on a higher manure application rates. So the previous slides were showing the dissolved phosphorus levels decreasing with time. But when we look at the solid poultry application experiments, we see something different. The 4 ton per acre broiler litter applications actually were showing increasing dissolved phosphorus levels in the runoff effluent with time. So that's opposite what we've seen in the dairy manure applications. The nitrate level changes are all over the board, but at the 4 ton applications we had just flat. So the nitrate level change did not change much significantly at the poultry litter. The ammonium in runoff, at the contrary, you see we have increasing ammonium concentrations in the runoff effluent, but when you have the 4 ton per acre litter application, it's also flat. We don't see any difference in time with ammonium level changes in the runoff effluent. And now we get to the swine slurry manure application experiments data. First look at the top left, the dissolved phosphorus level concentration in runoff effluent over time. At the 20,000 gallon per acre application, we see an increase in dissolved phosphorus level concentrations in the runoff effluent. At the 15,000 gallon, something happened. We have a very high level of concentration, 30 milligram per liter. So since we know the amount of runoff we measured, we can calculate that this 30 milligram per liter correlates to 1.7 pounds per acre dissolved phosphorus runoff from this field. So if you remember, the Schwein slurry minor had 76 pounds of P2O5 per 1,000 gallon. It was very concentrated on phosphorus. And with this high level of application, 15,000 gallon, we still experienced only 1.7 pounds of dissolved phosphorus per acre. So it's not catastrophic. So we don't have as bad impact to the environment with this Schwein slurry minor application when it comes to dissolved phosphorus runoff. Look at the nitrate levels with the Schwein slurry minor. We see a slight decrease in the higher application rates, that the nitrate levels would decrease with time. Except we at 10,000 gallon we see a slight increase, so something was not significant in here. I don't know what happened. But the ammonium levels are all decreasing with time in the runoff effluent. So that's good to know that ammonium level will be decreasing over time if you apply liquid Schwein slurry minor. I would like to go back to these experiments with the slurry dairy minor application to conventional tilled soils to see the sediment detachment from these minor applications, how minor applications impacted with time the sediment detachment on the soil samples. So if you look at the soil trace after the third rainfall simulation, we can see that the soil actually eroded at the edges, so that the minor application created this hard surface crust. It protected the soil from the rainfall impact, from the sediment detachment. But you can see some places the soil actually eroded from underneath this minor application layer. The control with no minor application, we measured 3.31 tons per acre soil loss, and 5,000 gallon per acre decreased the soil loss down to 1.08 tons per acre. So we can see in here how much benefit we can give to minor applications when it comes to soil loss and sediment detachment on farm fields. And we have the results in here on the table. On the top left, soil erosion level changes over time with the liquid dairy minor application to conventional tilled soil. That's what you just saw on the video before, and you see that the soil loss is decreasing when you have a lower application rate with time. But if you have a high minor application rate, the soil loss will not change over time. You have the same minimal soil loss because the soil application, the minor application created such a solid surface that it's protecting the soil from detachment. At the long-term no-till soil, you also see a significant soil loss reduction, but the magnitude is a lot less, since even the control had a lot less amount of soil loss because the soil quality is better. We had better infiltration rate, less runoff, and this way we had less detachment, less soil erosion. But definitely we have a huge impact on conventional soils when you apply minor. At this time I would like to bring your attention to table 3, showing all the different minor application rates and minor type impact to soil loss, sediment detachment. This presentation actually is at the American Society of Agronomy 2020 conference as a poster presentation. You could see it there. So if you look at the solid dairy minor to long-term no-till soil, the control was 0.25 soil loss, and with the minor application you can see higher minor application rate decreasing almost linearly the sediment detachment and soil erosion rate. The poultry litter was only 1, 2, 3, and 4 ton per acre application rate, but you see quite a bit of a decrease in detachment and soil erosion. The liquid dairy minor to conventional tilled soils, we see the biggest impact in reduction of soil loss because the control was 3.3 ton per acre soil loss. It's very significant, and by just 5,000 gallon liquid manure, we already brought down less than half. The liquid dairy manure to long-term no-till soils, you see the good impact of the surface cover from the manure, protecting the soil surface and decreasing runoff, improving infiltration, so that's why we have the less soil erosion rate. I do like to see the swine manure applications also decrease the soil detachment, soil erosion, but not as much since we had a good quality soil to start out with. This next table I think show you very good visually the different soil loss reductions. The top left is a sediment detachment from solid dairy manure on long-term no-till soil. But if you look at all four, you see there is everywhere a great deal of reduction in soil particle detachment and soil erosion. Of course, the biggest impact at liquid dairy manure to conventional tilled soils, that's on the top right, because the control was such a poor soil quality, we had 3.3 ton soil loss, and even just 5,000 gallon liquid manure already cut the soil loss in half. So we have to look at these charts, and you can understand how important it is in soil erosion prediction models to give appropriate credit for manure applications when it comes to soil loss prediction. And this would conclude my presentation. And please contact me if you have any questions. You can email me, you can call me, and also if you're interested in this presentation, you can visit the 2020 ASC conference in this November, where this will be presented on a poster and also on a video presentation. Thank you very much.
So that was Tibor's presentation. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat box. Tibor is online, so he can help answer those questions. And Tibor, I have a question for you. So these studies, you were leaving the manure on the surface the entire time. At least in Utah, for the solid manure, we require that you incorporate it within 3 days, if to prevent runoff. Would you still recommend that, or are you liking having the manure on the surface?
Yeah, we were discussing this option, but we have these soil trays. They are only like 2 inches deep, so the tillage would not work in this scenario. We could only focus on the surface application of manure, and that's what we studied. But if we could get a deeper trays, then yeah, we could probably replicate that situation when we would make an incorporation of solid manure or liquid manure and see the differences in infiltration and runoff. The main purpose of this whole research was to see this data, and then we put in a proposal for an NRCS initiative to fund similar projects nationwide, focusing on areas where nutrient pollution is a problem. So we will get a huger data set with the same setup, measuring nutrient runoff in effluents and sediments, and that would create a database we could use for these runoff prediction models. So we could add the nutrient data into the runoff prediction model. We could get a nutrient runoff prediction model. So that was the whole purpose, and hopefully this NRCS initiative will come out. And we have these rainfall simulators nationwide, I mean hundreds of them. Soil water conservation districts have them, NRCS offices, and Extension has them. So if they're interested in, they would apply for this initiative, getting funds for their time, for the sample analysis, and that would be a great thing to see nationwide how this nutrient runoff would change.
Okay. And then, do you have this information published anywhere, Tibor? Or is there a way people can access this data?
Okay, we are going to publish it in the Soil Water Conservation Journal with the ARS folks, and this will be presented at the American Society of Agronomy Conference, but also with a video presentation and a poster with the data. But hopefully we can get this article out with all the details, how we set it up. We're focusing on the journal, Soil Water Conservation Society.
Wonderful, thank you. And for those that are wondering, these presentations are being recorded and they will be available shortly after the conference. Let's see. And we have one more question. Appears you focused on soils with the history of manure application. Would you care to speculate as to manure application on soils with no recent history of manure application.
A very good point. So we're looking at farms, and farms typically have minor application history. That's why we were focusing on real farms. And that's what we typically see. The problems coming those farms, they are in business for a long time and they built up soil phosphorus levels and potassium levels. So, but yeah, we could replicate it with some to compare a soil with no minor application history versus with a farm soil with extensive minor application history. That's a good point.
Wonderful. Thank you. So it's now time for our next presentation. If you have more questions, you can continue to type them in, and Tibor should be able to answer them, I think. So, or we can try and get that information to you. Our next presenter is Tip Hudson with Washington State University, and he has a presentation on grazing for soil health in rangeland and agricultural ecosystems in the Pacific Northwest. And then there'll be a video, like a case study video right after his presentation, and then we'll open it up for questions. So.
Greetings. My name is Tip Hudson. I work for Washington State University Extension as a range and livestock management specialist. We're going to talk a bit about grazing for soil health in both rangeland and agricultural ecosystems in the Pacific Northwest. Globally, grazing lands are approximately half of the Earth's land area. These support the livelihoods of millions of people. Grazing lands are typically less productive than agricultural lands, or they would already be in cropland, but grazing lands are extremely important because they provide a myriad of other ecological goods and services. Things like water storage, water quality, water flow regulation, clean air, nutrient cycling, wildlife habitat, carbon sequestration. Grazing lands may store as much as 30% of global soil carbon stocks. And grazing principles, as we'll see, may be pretty consistent across the different kinds of grazed land types, but there's some different big picture goals in grazing rangelands relative to others, and we'd like to talk about both. So we need first to ask what are rangelands. Historically, rangelands were defined negatively by what they were not. Today, the textbook defines rangelands as plant community types that are dominated by grasses and shrubs. Interestingly, in a recent book on the history of rangeland science, Dr. Nathan Sayre of UC Berkeley says that rangelands are probably more like oceans than croplands or forests, in that they are vast and variable and they resist micromanagement. And in fact, he defines them as, quote, non-forested places where more intensive economic activities have not yet taken root. This may be cynical, but it is accurate in the socioeconomic context of most of the world. In the Pacific Northwest, rangelands are most of what is left over if you exclude cropland and forest. But this view shows everything that has less than 25% canopy cover. So it does include grazing on forested systems. My point here is that grazing management has the potential to affect, for better or for worse, nearly 2/3 of the Pacific Northwest. We can affect through grazing management the soil health and carbon sequestration rates on a very large percentage of the Pacific Northwest. What I'm calling agro-ecosystems, on the other hand, are managed primarily for agricultural output and only secondarily, if at all, for other ecosystem goods and services. A literature review from a little over a decade ago indicated that carbon sequestration potential on semi-arid rangelands is pretty limited, but carbon storage is quite significant and it's globally important. And I'm mentioning carbon storage because it's a good indicator for soil health. Perhaps against intuition, recent research indicates that grasslands are a more stable reservoir for organic carbon than forests are, since grassland carbon storage is mostly underground and is much less vulnerable to release through fire than forests or true shrublands, where the majority of carbon is above ground in woody plant tissue. In the shrub steppe, approximately 80 to 90% of the organic carbon is stored in the soil. And again, this is a very stable pool unless it's disrupted by tillage. And about 15% of that, the carbon in the soil fraction, is considered active, which means it's subject to short-term change based on climate or management. That flux really represents the difference between photosynthesis and decomposition. So conserving rangeland carbon stocks is pretty dependent on, one, avoiding land use conversion, and two, ensuring that the short-term sequestration opportunities are fully realized, primarily through good grazing management. There are a number of biotic and abiotic factors that influence soil health on rangelands, and these interact with each other, making the big picture pretty complex. Climate and soil texture mostly drive the plant community type. Climate and soil also drive soil depth or limit soil depth, soil carbon potential, and related hydrologic features. In addition, the time since a given management practice has been in place really affects to what degree that practice has affected soil health. So we could distinguish between increasing soil health, and again, I'm using soil carbon as a proxy indicator, and maintaining existing soil carbon stocks. Light to moderate grazing on grasslands has been shown to cause significant increases in soil carbon, as well as improvement in soil structure compared to heavy grazing. In fact, a 2016 study in the Great Plains found that improvements in grazing management over the last 50 years have recovered much of the soil carbon and nitrogen that was lost in the previous 50. And we're going to come back to what that kind of grazing looks like. But what specifically does, what ecological mechanisms does grazing affect? And how can we manage grazing to optimize these effects on soil health? Now, the grazing affects rates of plant photosynthesis. It affects the relative amounts of root material versus the above ground shoot growth. It affects how the plant allocates carbon. It affects the root mass and also plant root exudates that are important for soil structure and soil organic matter. I want to back up just a bit to talk about climate, and then we'll get back to grazing management. We tend to think of Western rangelands as being characterized by aridity, and this is certainly true. There's a distinct precipitation gradient starting at about the 100th meridian, right in the middle of the Great Plains, which is hugely agronomically significant. West of that line, we find much, much drier plant communities that require different kind of management than what we see east of the 100th meridian. But the variation in precipitation from year to year and the variation in forage production then on non-irrigated lands is a much bigger driver of ecological change. This variability challenges what we have historically thought about stocking rates. And since soil health depends on the maintenance of perennial plants, especially perennial grasses, a few years of serious overgrazing due to overstocking in a year with abnormally or anomaly low forage production can undo years of carbon storage. And this has negative economic consequences, not just ecological. And there are some indicators that this variability may be increasing, which increases the need for adaptive management and flexible stocking. This graph is showing forage production over about the past 35 years, going back to 1985 when the satellite data became available, and it shows the variation since that time from year to year. We see that variability increasing. And we can see this variability at home. Now, keep in mind that this example of a June photo taken 4 years apart is not necessarily evidence of climate change. This is the natural variability that's inherent in Pacific Northwest rangelands since at least the last ice age. However, the concern is that the swings between the high and the low years could be more extreme, and that has a pretty good basis. But we can see from this next photograph that there can be a significant difference from year to year in total biomass production on the same site. Both of these photos were taken before there was any grazing on these sites. The variability is a large driver of rangeland change. So what are the conditions that we're wanting rangeland ecosystems to bounce back to or resist movement from? What are the plant community attributes that promote soil health and that maximize or optimize the amount of soil carbon that we can hang on to? Some specific plant community attributes that are important are species composition, the diversity of functional and structural groups. The diversity of these groups has been promoted as a really good indicator of long-term rangeland health. The relative proportions of different ages of plants is also important. If plants are not reproducing, then we don't have young plants, and the old plants senesce and will eventually be replaced by perhaps less desirable plants. Canopy cover on the spaces between the rooted portion of the plant is quite important, and plant spacing is one way to describe plant communities and compare them one to another. All of these things are good, and we can identify specific problems that are associated with malfunction in any of these plant community attributes. Well, when these things are being managed toward rangeland health, we experience lower soil bulk density, higher water infiltration, higher water storage, higher resistance to erosion at the plant-soil interface, higher litter incorporation, which increases slightly soil organic matter, but probably more importantly, it helps to insulate the soil and provide some temperature amelioration. Attention to this to cover as an indicator of health is not new. Back in the 1930s, in the aftermath of the Dust Bowl, scientists were pretty quick to quantify this inverse relationship between cover and soil loss. Soil loss is a first order problem. We can see from this really old research that where there was only 50% ground cover, meaning you had 50% of the soil that was not covered by plants, they were measuring 4 tons per acre of soil loss. That is a gigantic agronomic failure and an ecological problem. The mechanisms here, at least if this is grazing land, is that excessive trampling combined with really low residual plant material post-grazing results in decreased soil pore space, reduced infiltration rates, and less plant available water. Those factors drive a decrease in root and mycorrhizal growth. This impairs soil structure and decreases nitrogen cycling, and those things all reduce plant productivity. That then changes the plant community, which tends to exacerbate the soil problems, and we get this wicked feedback loop that results in precipitously declining soil health. I want to be quick to add, those are not the results of all grazing, just bad grazing. There's abundant research showing that changing from heavy grazing to light or moderate grazing rapidly interrupts that wicked feedback loop and begins to work the other direction. This is why carbon markets pay more per acre on degraded ground, because degraded ground under improved grazing management can rapidly sink new carbon as it builds back root mass, soil organic matter, and the annual biomass produced by mostly perennial plants. Caveat here, a plant community shift that increases shrubs increases the amount of soil carbon that's stored above ground, which again is vulnerable to fire. If we're going to try to repair something, you first have to know exactly what broke. So we need to acknowledge and characterize what I'm calling improper grazing. I like to say that this is how the West was lost. People that came to the West moved here mostly from the East, and the people in the Eastern US came, most of them originally from Europe, which had more mesic plant communities that were dominated by sod forming or rhizomatous grasses that responded really well to frequent defoliation. The bunch grasses that dominate nearly all of the Western United States do not respond so well to frequent defoliation during the growing season. So what this downward successional sequence could look like is that if the dominant perennial grasses are grazed during their peak of growth every year, which is in April, May, and June, and they're grazed too close to the ground so that they experience very little regrowth after grazing, and the soil is not very covered during the summertime. And if we have season-long grazing that results in animals grazing whatever regrowth does occur, then these perennial grasses are at a significant competitive disadvantage to anything in the landscape that's not being grazed, including shrubs or plants that resist grazing through some physical mechanism, or plants that are unpalatable. So we end up with a lack of new desirable perennial plants, lack of reproduction. The old plants senesce and fade away. The ungrazed native plants expand, and then we also get exotic species that increase both in density and extent across the landscape. So we can end up with sagebrush, cheatgrass, knapweed, and some native short grasses like Poa secunda that tolerate close grazing. At this point, we've crossed an ecological threshold into a new degraded stable state that is undesirable. Stable meaning it's probably going to persist. I want to interrupt our regular programming with a short commercial about some case study videos that a group of us with the Center for Sustaining Ag and Natural Resources produced over the last few years. These case studies highlight three different aspects of rangeland management for soil health and rangeland resiliency. And I would encourage you to take a look at the website listed on the top of the slide and take a look at these 6 to 9 minute videos. They're worth seeing. Well, enough of what we should not do. What then do we do? I think all the principles I'm going to lay out here will apply on both rangeland and irrigated pastures, and I'll note a few differences as we go through. The first general principle is that stalking rate still matters. Stalking rate does not have to do with the relative intensity of management at a given point, either in space or in time. The stalking rate refers to how many animals we're allocating to an entire landscape over the course of a year. This is also not the utilization rate. Utilization refers to how much of the standing biomass has been grazed in a single grazing event. The stalking rate refers to how many animals we're allocating over a long period of time. The second general principle is that it's almost always beneficial to limit the duration of the grazing period. Whether we're talking about irrigated pasture, grazing cropland, or grazing rangeland, it's usually not a good idea to have animals in the same location for many months at a time. We might call this season-long grazing or multiple season grazing. Thirdly, on rangelands that are dominated by perennial bunch grasses, it's necessary to let the plants go to seed periodically. That can be accomplished by moving animals around the landscape. It can be accomplished by not turning animals in some years until after seed shatter. There's a number of ways that this can be accomplished, but the general guideline is that at some point over the course of a decade, these plants have to produce seed every once in a while. Fourthly, it's, if at all possible, it's important to allow plants to regrow within the active growing season after they've been grazed, or at least in the next growing season before the plants are grazed again. And keep in mind that for most of the Pacific Northwest, at least in the Intermountain West, the growing season is March through the middle of July, roughly. And so it's not a good idea to graze plants for all of those months. A conservative stocking rate tends to result in light to moderate utilization, but this can also be just accomplished by observing animals and limiting the duration of the grazing period and adjusting when animals are using a given piece of ground. And this has been a significant shift in our understanding of plant physiology over the last 50 years. It used to be thought that plants stored a significant amount of carbohydrate reserves in the plant crown and the roots, and that as long as you didn't chew up the plant crown with grazing animals, that plants would be fine. That is not the case. We discovered quite a few decades ago at this point that the plants store grass plants have a relatively small amount of carbohydrate storage, and what they do store is mostly in the basal portion of the stem. And so these grasses need to not get grazed below about 4 or 5 inches every year in order for them to have sufficient food storage to initiate growth in the next year. Keep in mind that extreme utilization also has economic consequences. Most notably that if you push animals too hard, it can cause declining body condition or declining animal health. At a landscape scale, we expect to see quite a bit of plant material left behind after the animals have used a given site. And whether in irrigated pasture or cropland or rangeland, livestock distribution is still pretty important so that individual areas are not overused and other places receive some use. One general principle is that relatively minor shifts in management can have quite significant results. This is a side-by-side fence line contrast with livestock grazing on both sides of the fence. The grazing principles that I have discussed have been observed in the background of the photograph. And in the foreground of the photograph, you have a smaller number of animals that are present for a long period of time, resulting in persistent pressure on the most preferred plants. And this has consequences for forage yield, for soil health, for riparian health, for water quality, for water storage, for fish habitat, for upland habitat. It really is a pretty comprehensive change, and the only difference may be limiting the duration of the grazing period and being careful not to utilize the most preferred plants heavily. These things also translate into profitability for livestock producers. I think that many ranchers may feel like grazing in the way that I'm describing is leaving money on the table. And I like to say that it's more like having money in the bank for several reasons. One is that if we maintain a diverse site-adapted plant community, especially on rangelands, what we get is high forage yield, high plant production. Further, if we maintain that kind of healthy plant community on irrigated pasture, in cropland, and on rangeland, we extend the amount of year characterized by active plant growth. And this has significant consequences for total forage production. And finally, animal health is maintained where the animals have access to a wide variety of plant species. Animals that are consuming a diversity of plants tend to have uh, better animal health, and we could define that by how much money is spent on pharmaceuticals for those animals. Animals are healthier when they have access to a wide variety of plant species and when they're not forced to eat low quality forage for a long period of time. These concepts and many others that are related are discussed in more detail at a podcast that I started a couple years ago called The Art of Range. You can subscribe through your favorite podcasting platform, or you can listen directly from the website at artofrange.com. And if you have suggestions for content or have some questions about material that's been covered on the podcast, I would encourage you to contact me directly by phone or email, and I would love to visit with you about it. Thank you.
Russ Stingley runs a cow-calf operation in Kittitas, Washington, on rangeland that is under checkerboard ownership, including parcels owned by Puget Sound Energy, the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the Washington Department of Natural Resources.
Well, our operation kind of consists of me and my boys, my daughter. We all, between all of us, we run about 850 cows, and the range ground consists of about 25,000 acres. We have some ownership of our own, but most of it's leased ground that spread out over the Kittitas Valley.
Stingley manages grazing under a Coordinated Resource Management, or CRM plan, which was developed by consensus among a voluntary coalition that includes the Stingley family, the landowners, and other local stakeholders, diverse partners who did not originally have a history of working collaboratively. Together, partners plan for multiple goals, including cattle production, wildlife habitat, and wildfire risk reduction.
We're here to generate renewable energy. We're the experts in the electrical field, but when it comes to managing the landscape, we really need those partnerships to help us manage going forward. Early on in the development process of the wind farm, we understood that traditional uses of the land was really important to the local community, and we wanted to make sure we committed to continuing with those traditional land uses and partner with the locals on implementing a more sustainable grazing plan throughout the facility that balanced the needs of both the grazing and wildlife habitat.
Based on the terms of the Coordinated Resource Management Plan, the Stingleys have a lower stocking rate than is usual for ranchers in their area. Stingley is managing with short grazing periods, low impact on plants and soil, and high post-grazing residual. Together, these strategies have supported high plant biodiversity and good animal health.
We backed the numbers off almost half when we took it over, and try to improve it some, which did help.
Describe the balancing act between like what's good for the ground and what's good for the cow. We're always worried about the cow, but you know, you can't just take everything from the ground either, because I mean, you need this again next year. It's not ideal for the cow, but she's doing fine. You know, she still looks good. We'll leave a little bit for the grass, and hopefully, you know, kind of put some in the bank for next year.
We had the CRM state tour out here, you know, and we went to a spring to the north here, and one of the guys asked, when will you graze this pasture? And I said, well, we just moved cows out 3 days before that, you know. So it's obvious it's not overgrazed when you have those kind of comments, you know.
The Stingleys have also improved distribution of cattle across the landscape by installing fencing and redeveloping water points with cost share from Puget Sound Energy, and by strategically locating salt, supplemental protein, and hauled water.
You know, we put in a lot of fence, which improved the ground as far as being able to utilize it better. By having more pastures, your rotation works better. The pines used to be one pasture. That pasture is actually 3 pastures now, so you can go early 3 times, you know, which you're back in the original rotation, where when it was 1 pasture, you only got to use that range ground early spring once out of 3 years. I think there's 26 springs we've redeveloped, because if your water's holding one place, that's where the cattle tend to be. So we've tried to develop as many springs as possible out here to spread cattle out, you know. And by using salt, and we haul water, moving water tanks to the outlying areas to pull cattle away from the other troughs, helps a lot in this country out here.
Grazing under a coordinated resource management plan is not without its challenges, including having to move cattle between pastures in a more complex pattern than previously. Overall, this leads to higher production costs, though manageable enough that the Stingleys can still run a profitable business.
You know, like from here to Whiskey Gym, we're looking at 2 miles, but we've had to go from here down to Park. So it's probably 8 miles that way, you know, and sometimes it's not where they want to go. And then another drawback when you jump pastures like that, you know, if you're just moving from one pasture next, you can push cows through and leave the gate open. And if the cow don't have its calf, she'll go back and get it that night, or the calf will follow. So they stay paired up. Where we jump now, like if we leave Whiskey Gym and come over here, sometimes we'll orphan calves, you know, even though we try to go back and find them and that.
Managing under the Coordinated Resource Management Plan has improved the condition and resilience of the vegetation. The Stingleys were able to maintain stocking rates even during a statewide drought in 2015, with a combination of healthy grass stands, supplemental protein, and providing water. Meanwhile, the Coordinated Management Plan has also led to documented habitat improvements. And despite the logistical challenges, the Stingleys feel like the Coordinated Resource Management Plan has given them access to land that they wouldn't otherwise be able to graze, so that they can maintain a way of life that they are passionate about.
Without it, the enjoyment part, I mean, it's kind of a way of life that we love doing out here. So, you know, you take away the candy, sometimes the other part's not that good, you know.
We have an abundance of wildlife species throughout the facility. We have Rocky Mountain elk, we have mule deer, we have reptiles, we have bear and cougar, and we have an abundance of bird life, including sage grouse. We have public access, recreation, grazing, hunting, and so having that balance was really important to PSE, and we believe we've achieved that balance.
You know, there is some headaches involved in this, but you don't have to concede that much to gain a whole bunch. Everybody basically has the same goal on a different, you know, how they go about it. And I think these agencies are gonna like see that it's working out here, you know, and like the wildlife's doing good, the birds are doing good, you know, the grass is doing good, and they're getting their objectives met. So I think it'll hopefully, you know, in the next 5-10 years, a lot of this opens up other ground for other people even.
Okay, with that, we're going to turn it over to questions. I know Tip has another engagement, so Tip, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. We had the one picture on...
Yeah, from Foster Creek.
From Foster Creek, yeah.
Yeah, that was a photograph of a wildfire that happened this year. That happened at the same time as some of the large ones that ran all over eastern Washington. It always looks like a nuclear bomb went off when you have a hot range fire that comes through. One of the main risks of a a summertime or hot season fire is that it's prone to start a canopy fire, similar to a forest, where you get the fire rushing through the sagebrush in particular, which has a lot of oil in the leaves, and it burns hot and it burns fast, and it pretty much takes out everything. The upside of one of these fast hot fires is that it tends to leave the perennial bunch grasses alive. They are adapted to fire, and most of the time survive fire. One of the main risks where you have lots of sagebrush, potentially, I don't see very many sagebrush carcasses in that draw. But one of the main risks of places where you had really dense sagebrush before the fire is that there often was not a remnant population of perennial bunch grasses underneath the sagebrush. And so there may not be a whole lot there to come back, which is one of the reasons why a hot fire in a draw like that, where there's lots of brush and a lot of white ash, is a good place to scatter some seed. I don't know whether or not this has been seeded, and I'm not sure if that's private land or public land, but that would be a good place to put some seed down. Somebody asked the question, do you see any role with biosolids in range management? That's tricky. I'm not sure. There's been a bit of research on using biosolids on dryland wheat ground, not as much on rangeland. The main problem is that when you add very much nitrogen to native rangeland, you tend to end up with more of the species that you don't want. So it does cause a flush of growth. It does cause an increase in total rangeland production or yield, but it tends to be an increase in weedy forbs or weedy grasses, and not so much the stuff that we'd like to keep.
Okay, do we have any other questions, or I know you need to head out soon here, Tip, so.
No, we're fine. Yeah, I don't remember now how thoroughly I addressed that in the video, but about 85% of the carbon storage in rangelands is below ground. So even when you have a fire that comes through like that one, that looks like it got nuked, the majority of that carbon storage is still below ground, and so it's not nearly as vulnerable as a forest fire.
Is that true even for the bunch grasses?
Yes.
Okay.
It's not so much that the root mass below ground is equal, it's that the total carbon in the system is tied up in soil organic matter and other materials that are not active living roots.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, with that, I think I'm not seeing any more questions right now, and it's about time to move on to the next presentation. Next up is Georgine Yorkie. Thank you, Tip. And she'll be doing an introduction video, and then there'll be 2 case studies on livestock and crop integration in the Pacific Northwest. So we'll have Georgine's initial video and then 2 case study videos following, and then we'll have a chance for questions and answers.
Hi, my name is Georgine Yorkie. I work at Washington State University, and I'm going to be sharing this morning 2 videos that explore farmers' experiences with integrating livestock into cropping systems. These 2 videos were part of a project that I completed with quite a number of collaborators. The collaborators in these 2 videos include Christy Borelli, Kate Painter, Andy McGuire, and Doug Finklenberg. And I hope that you leave this morning's session with an appreciation that there are innovative producers across the region who are developing profitable systems for reintegrating crops and livestock. It's not necessarily easy, but they are forging ahead. And then I also up there just provided the link. So if you're interested in exploring the videos in more detail, looking at any of the other videos, or looking at the written case studies, they're available. The two videos I'm going to show this morning, as I said, are part of a larger case study project that we did to explore innovative strategies that forward-thinking farmers are using across the Pacific Northwest to increase the resilience of their systems to future stressors. And that included both climate stressors, but also, economic stressors, social stressors in a lot of cases that people see coming down the pike. So this is a map that shows the locations of the different case studies that we did, and also pictures of the participating farmers. We also did a smaller set of 4 rangelands case studies that I'm not showing here. The idea with the case study project was really twofold. First, we wanted to leverage and amplify the potential for farmers to learn from each other across a wide geographic area, so kind of farmer to farmer learning, and we were hoping to facilitate that. And then second, we wanted to explore the motivations, the challenges, and the benefits that these forward-thinking farmers were experiencing as they adopted a range of new strategies across the region. Each case study has 2 parts, so there's both the video that I'll share today, and then there's a peer-reviewed written document that provides a whole bunch more detail, and also that connects sort of farmers' lived experiences with adopting new strategies with where there's relevant research with that research. So it's kind of making that connection for people. The 2 videos that I'm going to share today, one is in a dryland system and one is in an irrigated system. So first, Drew Leach will talk about his experience integrating grazed cover cropping into a dryland system near Nez Perce, Idaho. And then second, Eric Williamson will talk about integrating manure applications and grazing into irrigated annual vegetable production in the Columbia Basin. I'm mostly just let the videos speak for themselves, or Drew and Eric speak for themselves, but in thinking overall about, what do we see in these 2 videos as a whole, I think that one common theme that will probably come out is that grazing and manure is one piece of a much larger picture for both of these farmers, and really driven, I would say, in both cases by a desire to improve soil health in their operations. So that, you'll see that they're not talking about reintegrating livestock as necessarily the only strategy they're using, or even the central strategy that they're using, but sort of alongside other things such as eliminating or reducing tillage, adding cover crops, that these various pieces work together. And second, I think they're a really nice contrast to each other because they show how different the strategies and the constraints are in these 2 very different systems. So in particular, water is so constraining in dryland systems, and that creates a different set of challenges for integrating livestock and particularly for cover cropping.
A small but growing number of dryland farmers across the inland Pacific Northwest have been trying to integrate cover crops into their farming systems with the goal of improving soil health. While many farmers in this region are interested in the practice, they're also concerned that cover crops could deplete soil moisture and decrease yields for their harvested crops. Drew Leach, whose farm in Nez Perce, Idaho receives between 17 and 23 inches of precipitation annually, has been successfully able to produce both spring-seeded and fall-seeded cover crops.
I'm a 3rd generation farmer. Was born and raised here. The farm consists of about 2,500 acres of tillable ground and about 3,000 acres of pasture ground. I run about 120 cows, and it's a cow-calf operation. And then in those acres, we raise anywhere from bluegrass to hay, hay for the cows, obviously, and then wheat is a primary crop, along with bluegrass, canola, garbs, peas, lentils. Trying to improve the soils is probably my biggest goal in this whole process.
Over his first 4 years of experimentation, Drew has been most successful growing a spring-seeded cover crop mix of peas, lentils, grazing oats, triticale, and brassicas. The cover crop complements and enhances his existing grazing operation by providing much-needed summer forage for his cow-calf herd.
The limiting factor for me was, in my cattle operation, was the pasture. I mean, starting in about late June, it starts turning, and then I start losing food value or feed value, and so those animals don't do as well, and that's my limiting factor. Well, if I can utilize a portion of a few of the acres as crop to put through those cows, well, then that means I can increase those numbers, and that can be a more sustainable part of the farm, another leg, I guess you would say, on the chair. They graze the green and growing crop, but then it's going to mature, and so I've got to knock that crop down or stop it from getting over mature, because then they don't get any benefit out of it. So then about a third of that field, then I swath grazed, which means that I just went out and swathed it, left it in the windrows, and left it unconditioned so that it would keep longer. And then I kept moving the fence across there because I need the manure and the cows to move across those acres. And then the other third of it I swathed and baled, and so it would keep for a lot longer, and then I bale grazed it. When I got done at the end, that cow-calf pair, the cow was in much better condition than any of the other cows in all my other pastures, because they were out on dry grass for 2 months. I mean, where it had dried up and that's all they had. I mean, nothing regrew. But these animals had really good feed all the way through, and you could visibly see in those animals that they were much healthier, much happier, and the fact that their feed was much better.
So far, Drew has found that cover crops benefit soil health and do not deplete soil moisture. He is therefore cautiously optimistic that the system he is developing will provide ongoing benefits to his operation.
Well, initially I was very skeptical about any crop growing all the time because we're trying to conserve the moisture. But what I found in the first year that they had the cover crop growing, they had some strips of chem follow that I sprayed out and left just treated just as chem follow, and then the others had growing crops on them. What I found surprising was that we went out and measured with a penetrometer that there was actually more moisture in the lusher, greener growing crop than there was on the chem follow. So there was less soil moisture loss where there was a growing crop than there was in that dead environment. I intentionally, a year ago, I put it on a poor piece of ground, the cover crop. I had several neighbors, who drive past that field all the time, who had watched, and the judgment that they had was that piece of ground, that wheat just looks a lot better. Now, as far as soil tests, and I mean, I've got all that information, and there wasn't huge variances, but there's just something that you can't really put your finger on, but you just know it looks better. 3 to 4 years is not, in the window of time, it's very, very small, and I would expect that the cover crop is going to be something that's going to add to our soil over time, but it's going to take time. Even without the incentives now, I will continue to utilize the cover crop and the grazing, because it changes the whole way that I look at my farm. Instead of just being a wheat farmer, well, now it's kind of like I'm a rancher and a wheat farmer, and I can utilize both of those to my benefit, because I can increase those animals and have a stronger leg on that chair as far as economic support. So I feel a little bit safer doing it, to be honest with you.
In partnership with his family, Eric Williamson runs an irrigated vegetable farm in the Columbia Basin. Over the last 15 years, the farm has switched from conventional tillage to a mix of strip tillage and direct seeding in an effort to reduce soil loss and crop damage caused by high winds and blowing sand. Complementary practices include cover cropping, integrating livestock, and amending his soils with manures.
This past year we strip tilled 4,500 acres. We did about 3,500 acres of sweet corn and about 1,000 acres of lima beans and a little bit of edamame. We grow canola for seed sometimes when the contracts are available, and we also plant that with a strip till. Really the only thing that we grow that's not strip tilled are the green peas, which are planted with a grain drill, and the majority of those are direct seeded into the cover crop that we planted the prior year. We used to do full tillage, and when a spring windstorm would come up, it was really challenging to keep all the water running and try to keep it from blowing. We've had crops sawed off and had to replant, and sand's really good and abrasive, so when it blows you can oftentimes lose your stand. The rule I always used to use for myself was if we were going to have a 15-mile-an-hour wind or more, we were going to start the water and try to get everything wet before it got here, and now I don't really even think about it till we're 25-30 miles per hour. And usually with all the residue out there, if you can get one lap of the pivot before a 30-mile-an-hour wind, you usually don't have any problems. We were prepared to take a yield reduction when we switched to strip tillage. As we looked at it, we said, with all this less tractor work, the benefits of not blowing and not leaching your fertilizers and stuff, even if this costs us a ton an acre, say a 10% yield reduction or that sort of thing, we think we're going to still think it's a good deal. And so we didn't really ease into it the first year. We just did all of our acres that way, and we saw no yield reduction. There's still people that are doing conventional tillage around, and the yields are really similar.
High residue farming has also provided some unanticipated benefits. The Williamsons realized that with strip tillage, they could sometimes harvest 2 crops in a single growing season.
A couple of years into it, we had the opportunity to try to double crop peas and corn, and it worked really well because we could turn it around so fast. Under conventional tillage, it could take a week or something to get everything prepared and planted, and we can be planted the next day really. And so it kind of allowed us to grow and do a better job with less input. I think the equipment that we use is more expensive than the stuff we used when we were doing full tillage, but there's less of it.
Besides double cropping, Eric has also incorporated livestock into his high residue system and is amending soil with animal manure before renting ground to a neighbor to grow potatoes.
We grow processing vegetables and beef cattle. The combination of the two, I think, is pretty important for us. A lot of vegetable residues are good cattle feed. We bring in calves and put a few hundred pounds on them before they go onto a feedlot. One benefit that really ties in to having grazing animals, that really ties into the conservation tillage, is that by grazing the sweet corn stalks, you reduce the residue load a little bit and convert it into a product with some value. And it makes strip tillage the next fall much easier. If you have full residue available, you can still strip till into it, but it's more challenging. And compost, yeah. The typical product that we use is feedlot manure that's been stacked for a year or so and dry. We don't get a lot of nitrogen benefit out of it because it's been dried and a lot of the nitrogen's disappeared, but oftentimes going before potatoes, they don't want that big nitrogen load. We're mostly after P&K and organic matter.
These practices work together to build organic matter, reduce soil erosion, and improve the soil's structure and ability to hold water.
Probably since strip tillage started. At that time, you didn't see many soil tests that had over 1% organic matter, and now it's really common to have 1.5, and we'll be over 2 sometimes. And I don't know if I can ascribe which practice really promoted that. I think it's a whole system, between
leaving more residue, grazing and returning a lot of residues and cover crop feeds to the soil, and applying compost and manure. I think all those things have been positive for organic matter. It's a little bit harder to make this soil blow now than it used to be. I think that's been pretty instrumental in increasing our water holding capacity. We seem to be able to water slower and deeper than we used to. We can just retain more moisture, and it's improved our management of our irrigation. It allowed us to, slower irrigations really help for disease control on some of these crops. I think it's been a real game changer for us, really. I don't think we'd be doing some of the things we're doing now if it weren't for strip till and direct seed.
Okay, Georgine, are you on? I'm not seeing you. Okay, we do have one question on just what is chem fallow. Chem fallow is when you're actually trying to do that fallow rotation, but you're using chemicals to control the weeds instead of tillage. It doesn't have to be Roundup, although Roundup would be a common one that would be used. And the rationale behind chem fallow is that by not tilling, you're keeping more of that moisture in the soil. You're just killing the weeds that would suck up the moisture. Do we have any other well, I guess we don't have Georgine on. Any other questions? If not, it's time for a short break. So we get to go stretch our legs for just a minute. We will start back up again at 10:30 Pacific time, 11:30 Mountain time. So I hope to see you back in just a few minutes. Thank you. Okay, welcome back to our Pasture and Rangeland session, which is part of the Nutrient Cycling, Soil Health, and Food Safety Conference. We thank you for joining us. Our next presenter will be Andrew McGuire. And as with the others, we'll play the video and then we'll have a live question and answer session. We do ask that you keep your microphones muted and use the chat box to ask your questions. And with that, I will start Andrew's presentation.
Good morning or afternoon or whatever it is where you are. Back in 2016, I had some questions about manure. Not about the actual spreading of manure or calculating the application rates, but about manure's role in sustaining agriculture. Is manure a sustainable organic amendment able to build soil organic matter levels? Is manure a sustainable source of nutrients? And how far can manure go in agriculture in both sustaining soils and their nutrient levels? So I wrote a series of essays on these questions, and you can get those online if you want to see the details. And that's what I'm going to cover today. So manure is promoted as a sustainable solution, but really, is it? So what I'm asking in terms of soil health is, can manure, the manure that we have, maintain the current levels of soil organic matter? So sustain that soil organic matter level in our soils. In terms of soil fertility, would that manure be able to replace the nutrients removed in the annual harvest of crops? That's what I'm going to be talking about. Our livestock produce a lot of manure. Every year, livestock in the United States produce about 335 million tons of manure. At 1 ton a minute, it would take you about 637 years to pile up that much manure. I want you to think about this. If we took that much manure and spread it equally over all the US cropland, how much manure would be available per acre each year? And I'll give you the answer to that in the end. But back to my question, would it be able to sustain our soils? First, let's look at what it might take to sustain soil health. So soil organic matter reflects the balance of what is added and what is lost. And in this ideal situation, you've got a crop that is harvested. So the biomass is taken off the field, it's fed to livestock, the manure is produced and then collected and then spread back on that field that produced the feed. It's an ideal situation, doesn't happen very often, but that's what I'm going to use to make these calculations. So we know there's losses in this process, and we also know there's losses of soil organic matter in the field. So how do they compare? On one side, we have the process that we just looked at, the crop to livestock to manure to spreading the manure back on the soil. On the other side, we have this continual loss of soil organic matter due to decomposition. We can sustain our soils when that gain is equal to the loss on an annual basis. Let's look at the losses on the feeding side first. So manure doesn't come from livestock, but originates with the crops. So I'm going to look at the total biomass produced by a crop that's harvested and taken off the field, and I'm starting with that. So on that basis, we can actually estimate a manure production per acre. And the loss in this process from crop to livestock is about 57, there's a range, 57 to 81%. This includes feeding losses, includes the production of meat, milk, and eggs, which is what we want, why we feed livestock, and so that's a good loss. Also includes respiration of the animals. The next loss is after it's produced. So you've got collection and transport. This is much less. It's only about 4 to 8% of that total starting amount that we harvested off the field, or about 10 to 40% of the manure excreted. So if you add this up from crop to livestock to manure to spreading it back on the field, you've got a total of 61 to 89% total dry matter loss between the crop and manure application. The range of losses and the production, it all depends on your type of livestock, what do you have, cattle, pigs, or chickens, the type of production system, and the region in the country. So I had to make some decisions, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those right here. So cattle by far produce the most manure, so these calculations are for them. I had two scenarios. One, I used average grain yield. The other one, I used irrigated silage yield with dairy. And the range here, this 1.6 to 5.7 tons per acre, and this is dry, of manure represents the range of production from the various systems of livestock. So this is what I'm going to use for our manure production rate. We've got one more loss to look at, and this is the loss that after you spread it on the soil or incorporate it in the soil, you still have some more decomposition before a portion of the manure becomes actual soil organic matter. So here, another 10 to 31% of that original dry matter is lost. Of the manure applied, only about 8 to 21% becomes soil organic matter. And in my calculations, I optimistically used the 21% because it matches results from a research project in Pendleton, which is fairly nearby. So if you add it all up, you end up with 92 to 99% of the mass is lost from crop to soil organic matter. It's not looking so good, but this needs to balance the losses in organic matter, which we haven't talked about. So let's look at them first. So we looked at the gain. We need to look at the other side. The amount you need depends on the amount of soil organic matter you have. So here, the losses, estimated losses in soils are about 1 to 5% of soil organic matter each year. So the more soil organic matter you have, the more inputs are needed to maintain it. The rate of loss, that 1 to 5%, varies depending on several factors that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. So we've looked at this, the gain, which is going to be about 21% of that manure rate that we have. And then the losses is 1 to 5% of your total soil organic matter in your soil. If you combine those two, you come up with a table like this. And here, if you look at the numbers, this is the acres of crop production required to produce the manure needed to maintain 1 acre of soil organic matter. So if the number is 1 down here, if we got a number of that's less than 1, that means we can actually sustain organic matter levels with the production from 1 acre. Where we go into this yellow area where it's above 1, that means we need more than 1 acre of feed to produce the amount of manure needed to sustain organic matter of 1 acre. And you can see it ranges from 1.2 to 5.9. So in the yellow area, it takes more than 1 acre of manure. And this is in the range, in the ballpark of the others who have done the similar calculations. So I figure I'm pretty confident in these numbers. We can answer our question, can manure sustain the soil that produced it? The answer in general is no, except for soils with low organic matter levels or low loss rates. There is not enough manure produced to sustain the organic matter in lots of our soils. And because compost comes from crop or plant production, it's in the same boat. I'm not going to go through compost calculations, but it's basically the same type of deal. They cannot sustain or soil organic matter on the land that produced them, so it's not sustainable for agriculture in general. Can it be used can these amendments be used beneficially on some fields? Of course. They are good practices. I'm just saying they're not going to sustain organic matter in all our soils. This will always work. Take organic waste off a large land area, or not even organic waste, but the crop production in the case of manure. Apply it to a small area. It's always going to improve your soil, your plant growth, etc. There was an example in the headlines a few years ago where they took orange peels, applied it to a tropical forest, and you can see the difference on the right compared to the left of that the orange peels made after a while. I looked at the original research, the ratio of the area that produced the orange peels versus what they put it on was 30-to-1. Again, getting back to that idea that we're concentrating the organic matter or waste in this case from a large area to a small area. It's always going to work, but it doesn't scale. So what we have in these situations is an apparent abundance. It's like fish from the open ocean or hardwoods from the rainforest. Manure's abundance or scarcity is hidden because the distant sources make it difficult to see the production details. But what we really have with manure is a scarce resource. So I made some rough calculations again. How much of our cropland soil could be sustained by manure? And this is overall, about 20%. So when we look at farms, we can't generalize from those farms that are lucky enough to have large amounts of compost or manure available, and they can actually increase their soil organic matter levels. But they are localized exceptions. By itself, there's not enough manure or compost to sustain soil organic matter levels. There's some things we can do to change the rates here. On both sides of the equation, you can reduce your soil organic matter loss rate through some of these practices. You can also increase the additions to soil organic matter through some of these practices. And those did not come into factor in these calculations. So this is just based on the amount of manure going on a field or the amount of compost going on a field, and none of these other practices. So on to nutrients. I'm not going to go through all the calculations for nitrogen and phosphorus, but again, using that high and low manure production scenarios, the manure needed to replace nitrogen, here we have 22.2 tons per acre is needed. For phosphorus, it's only 3.8. So for the low scenario, you compare the needed to the produced, and you need 13.9 times more area of crop production to produce the manure to replace that nitrogen on 1 acre. Phosphorus, it's only 2.4 in the high scenario, 3.9, and only in the case of the high scenario, high manure production for phosphorus can it be a 1-to-1 ratio or less. So that means that farms that are close to manure sources that can apply enough manure to supply the nutrients to their crops can only do this because there are other fields that are producing manure through feed crops that don't get enough manure in return. So again, it's not a sustainable solution in general. If we spread the manure over all the cropland, you can look at it by state, how much manure versus how much, if we spread it all over evenly, how much nitrogen and phosphorus you would get. You can see they're fairly minimal numbers. 9.4 pounds per acre of nitrogen in Washington, only 2.4 pounds of phosphorus. Washington has lots of cropland, not such high manure production rate. It's always good to get a second opinion. These maps are from USDA, and they look at, again, spreading the manure that's in each county. They go by county, spreading the manure that's produced in that county on the cropland in that county. How much of the nitrogen that is needed could be supplied from the manure. You can see here, very few counties can provide 100%. A little bit more can provide 50 to 100%, but almost all the counties are less than 50%. And most of those counties are significantly less than 50%. If you look at phosphorus, it's a little better case in some counties, but not much better. Again, we're not producing enough manure to provide, to replace the nutrients that we need from crop harvest. So in general, manure is not a sustainable source of nutrients. For individuals, farmers, yes, but not for agriculture. Why? Because it will not sustain anywhere near our current production. And that's because of the losses that we talked about. So soil health in general requires manure plus those other management options that I mentioned before: high residue crops, reduced tillage, residue retention, cover crops, perennial crops, that kind of thing. Soil fertility requires manure plus synthetic fertilizers, compost, organic fertilizers. Those are all good practices, but manure by itself is not going to do it for us. So manure is a scarce resource. It's like that gold leaf. We can spread it thin, but it's not going to do what we need it to do. So back to this, is there a lot of manure for cropland or a little? Again, if we spread all the manure that we produce over all the cropland, it comes up to be about 0.8 tons per acre dry or 1.1 tons per acre wet at 33% moisture. So 1.1 ton of manure, you couldn't hardly see it if you spread that over. So it's really not very much. Again, manure is a valuable resource, but there's not enough of it to maintain levels of organic matter or our nutrients. Here's the link for the blogs or the essays if you want to read them. Look at all the details and the calculations and my contact information. And I look forward to answering some of your questions.
Thank you. So we have some time for some questions. Andy, there's a question on how would this balance apply to pastures where the forage is eaten directly and the manure deposited back on the pasture? Their question is, would that limit many of the outlined losses?
In that case, it's probably the pasture and the perennial grasses that are going to maintain your soil organic matter. And in that case, you do get a better cycling of the nutrients than you do because you don't have the losses with transporting, feeding operations that are far away from the field than the collection and storage and the losses that you have there. So it is a better case depending on how high your soil organic matter levels are.
And then there's a question, would that apply to the pasture lands in the eastern region or eastern part of the U.S.?
Most of my calculations were for cropland. With pasture lands, again, your losses are much less because you have less disturbance. You have the perennial crops that are putting down carbon down deep in the soil. So pasture lands are generally in a much better situation than cropland.
And another question, how does the addition of carbon to a field from photosynthesis fit into your carbon balance?
Well, what I started with was the crop production, which is, the addition to from photosynthesis incorporated in that feed value that I started with, except for the parts that are not harvested. So your crop residues and your roots. Crop residues they serve a good benefit in terms of preventing erosion, but they're not going to add to their soil organic matter very much. Your roots are going to add much more. We didn't calculate that. So I would say that the roots are not incorporated in that calculation, but depending on your tillage operation and how much that loss rate is, it may not matter.
Okay. I found it really interesting how few counties actually had an excess of nutrients in the manure, because it seems like that's a big, huge issue. So what do you think is the primary limiting factor on that?
On nutrient recycling?
Yeah, or just, so from a livestock perspective, the livestock producers oftentimes have issues with having places to take the manure. So, but if we have that much ground that actually could use it, what are the primary limiting factors?
I would say the transport costs, especially of fresh manure, because it's got so much water in it. It's just heavy and it's expensive to haul off compared to the dry feed that you're bringing in. I mean, that's much easier it's much easier to bring in all that dry feed than it is to take all the wet manure back out to those fields that produce the feed. That's why we have that concentration of manure around feeding operations.
Very good. Okay, we're almost ready for the next one. I do see a comment on for this questioning the code for the CEUs. For the CEU codes for this session, it'll be presented at the very end. So we have a few more talks to get through, and then I'll put it up on the screen for you. Okay. And we'll also have a poll at the very end. So please stick around and help present that. Thank you very much, Andy. Very interesting. And up next is Rick Kelsch, the University of Nebraska, on the perceptions of barriers and benefits of manure use in cropping systems.
Greetings from Nebraska. I'm very honored to have an opportunity to share a few things that we have learned over this past year relative to the perceptions of barriers and benefits of manure use in cropping systems. My name is Rick Kelsch. I am with the University of Nebraska, and I'd also like to recognize my collaborators from Iowa State University and the University of Minnesota in this activity. I think we're all aware of the importance of recycling nutrients within our animal agricultural systems. Our ability to move the nutrients that an animal excretes in manure into our soils and cropping systems, produce animal feeds and possibly other crops as well, and then return those animal feeds to the animal. That recycling loop is extremely important to the sustainability of our animal agricultural systems. Now, in today's environment here in Nebraska, we are challenged by an increasing separation between those places or those facilities that are producing animals and those farms or businesses that are producing the crops. And as that separation grows greater in terms of distance or in terms of just business entity separation, that of our ability to continue that recycling loop is continuously challenged. And as we think about the importance of moving manure nutrients to fields that have historically not had manure, and moving those nutrients further and further away from our animal feeding operations, this is a challenge that we need to understand and do a better job of here in many of our Midwestern states. To better understand how we're going to address some of these challenges, we felt it was important to conduct a survey of perceptions of manure's benefits and barriers. And there were two questions in particular we wanted to answer. We wanted to learn what challenges rise to a level that prevents manure use in crop production, and then what is understood and valued relative to manure's potential benefits. We had an opportunity to interact with a number of stakeholder groups as we defined the questions that went into that survey, and we had a number of wonderful partners that helped us in terms of that promotion of that survey, including the Manure Manager magazine and the Certified Crop Advisor program. In terms of who participated, we had roughly 900 survey responses that we were able to utilize in our results, and many of them came from the Midwest region, the Corn Belt, in through the Mid-Atlantic region of the US. So there is a little bit of bias relative to location of where these responses are coming from that you need to be aware of. In terms of the tremendous promotion that we had from the American Agronomy Society, we had a significant response from the advisory community, especially the private sector advisory community. But even though we had a strong response there, we still had more than 200 animal feeding operations that responded and more than 300 crop production farms that responded. We'll start with just an introduction to what we learned from 3 specific questions and then share a few take-home messages in terms of the overall survey. One of the questions that we wanted to understand, to what degree do you value or do you consider manure to either be a benefit or a harm relative to certain field or characteristics in crop production? 2 of our questions related to agronomic issues, how important or how valuable is manure in terms of crop fertility and nutrition and in terms of yield. And as you can see, overwhelmingly, individuals that responded felt that manure was beneficial or at least slightly beneficial. And there was almost no responses over here in the harmful or slightly harmful range. When we asked a similar question relative to soil health or soil characteristics from both a physical and a biological perspective, there was overwhelmingly a response that favored manure as being beneficial or at least slightly beneficial. The only question that we answered relative to this that had kind of a mixed review was in the area of water quality. Just over 1/3 of those that participated saw manure as being beneficial to water quality, and just under 1/3 of those that participated saw manure as being harmful to water quality. And as we've gone through a couple of decades of defining practices and regulatory approaches that minimize the risk of manure to water quality, I think we understand why many of our answers are on that harmful side. But we're seeing a growing trend of individuals responding that manure offers benefits in terms of water quality. So we'll talk more about that in just a second. We also asked in terms of when manure and fertilizer are compared, what do you believe to be the most true? And we were trying to understand in terms of, is a competitive environment for manure versus fertilizer, or is it more of a complementary environment? And we were rather surprised by some of the responses that we got from this survey. 70% of those that responded suggested that manure and fertilizer were in complementary roles. In terms of those that felt it was competitive, we had a rather small percentage that believed fertilizer was preferred in that competitive role or that manure was preferred. Now, I think the reason for this large response in this area comes back to who actually responded to the survey. And since this was a voluntary survey, we saw those that had been frequent users of manure in the past tended to dominate the responses of this survey. If I was to ask this same question with our typical Nebraska corn producer, I would think we would see this competitive environment where manure is preferred being the more dominant response. So this response, I think, is more connected with the audience that identified themselves or chose to respond to this survey. So what were some takeaways relative to the benefits of manure? I think we were pleased to see that there is a strong peer group within agriculture, both in the consulting and in the production side of agriculture, that values and understands the agronomic and soil health benefits of manure. think based upon that, one of the questions that we've been raising here in Nebraska is how do we involve this peer group more and more in telling the story of where manure is valued and why it might be considered as part of a fertility program. We also have been thinking in terms of how do we help farmers target fields to achieve the greatest value from manure for specific fields. So what fields benefit from a soil health perspective? What is the economic return of one field versus another from more the agronomic or soil fertility perspective or value of manure? And so how do we tell that story more clearly? And we are asking more and more about how do we define complementary manure and fertilizer fertility strategies so that we're taking advantage of that complementary value of the two products together. One other question or perception that we have relative to manure's benefits relates back to this water quality response and that mixed response that we saw. We think we need to do probably a better job of helping farmers understand and articulate what are the water quality risks with over application of manure, which has been our history, versus the water quality risk associated with an agronomic application. I think there's a strong case to be made in terms of manure's benefits, in terms of reducing erosion and runoff from fields that have received manure, and in terms of the less mobility of some of our organic packaged nutrients as opposed to our inorganic nutrient sources. And so can we tell this story, help farmers be able to articulate that better, to better represent the advantages of manure is from a water quality perspective. Our second set of questions focused around the challenges associated with using manure and which of these challenges rise to the level of becoming a barrier that prevents manure use in some cropping systems. We provided people with roughly 35 alternative challenges to pull from and asked them to identify those challenges that became a barrier to manure use, and wanted to share with you our top 10 from this group of challenges. As you might expect, the top challenges out of this top 10 were associated with economics, transportation and application costs rising to the very top. Second on this was neighbor-related issues. Issues such as odor became a barrier for 8 out of 10 of those that responded, at least in some of the fields in which they had hoped to apply manure to. We had several logistical issues that rose to the top. Some issues such as timeliness of the application, field conditions that limited application, time and labor requirements. And in particular, I'm interested about, in my just observations here in Nebraska, about the connection between this issue and transportation cost. I think I often hear people decide it is inappropriate to move manure because of the cost of transportation when they're often talking in terms of the accessibility of labor, the accessibility of equipment for making that haul of manure an extra few miles. And so what's the connection between those is something I would like to understand better. Several issues related to agronomic concerns in terms of such things as compaction, uniformity, and weed seeds. Our ability to respond to some of these kind of questions is going to be important if we're going to help crop farmers become greater users of the manure in their fertility programs. And then the last issue that we put into our top 10 or showed up in our top 10 was regulatory issues. Manure's perception that it is more regulated than commercial fertilizers is preventing manure being distributed further away from our animal feeding operations to fields that have historically not had manure. And so in some ways, our regulations may actually be impeding improvements in water quality because of that perception. So what are some takeaways from the barrier side of this discussion? In terms of economics, I think we need to better understand how we can reduce transportation costs, and are those transportation costs related to just the availability of the labor and equipment, or is it just financially too expensive? I think we've seen in a number of places here in Nebraska where we've developed a strong service sector for brokering manure, transporting manure, and application of manure. And in those situations, it's been my observation that manure is moved further and further from its traditional application sites. I think we also need to understand how we're going to address neighbor issues, strategies that will reduce odor. As an example, in Nebraska, where we surface apply a lot of our manure, we've spent a fair amount of time focusing on the role of 3 to 5 day weather forecast for identifying neighbors and fields that are higher risk or lower risk. And then we'll briefly wrap up with the fact that there's a number of logistical agronomic barriers to manure. And as a general rule, I think we need to think in terms of what should be the 4 R's like we have with fertilizer products. What are those 4 R's for manure, and how can they help us address some of the logistical and agronomic challenges? So that summarizes what we've learned from our survey. I appreciate the time to share those ideas with you, and I look forward to the conversations that we might follow in our Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. If you have any questions, please post those in the chat box. And so,
hi, Rhonda.
Hi. Good, you're on.
Yes, I'm on.
And you're
just no questions about football would be the only thing I ask.
Yeah, that wasn't so good. Are you still mourning?
Still mourning, yes.
So I do have a question. Do you think that the concern on weed seeds will become even more prevalent or a bigger concern as we end up with more and more Roundup resistant weeds?
Well, we've certainly seen that issue with Palmer amaranth, and in our cattle industry here in Nebraska, that is a concern. And I'm not a weed scientist to help respond to that, but yes, that is a challenge that needs to be better dealt with as a barrier. I was surprised it didn't show up a little higher in our survey, though. But
yeah,
it's still a concern.
Me, I was too. As I was looking at the results, I was like, huh, because the weed seeds is one thing, but when you start getting the Roundup resistant ones, it can be so problematic in the cropping systems. That could be a hard hurdle to cross, I think. So.
Maybe the one, I don't know if it's a saving grace or not, but we've done such a great job of distributing that Roundup resistant Palmer amaranth around the state. Maybe that problem is already there in many cases.
Maybe. We do have a question. What are the next steps that you are planning now that you have the results from your study?
Okay. We're using it in our 3 states to guide some of our educational programming. And I guess more we're just targeting what messages we want to focus on. From the barrier side, we're trying to identify, what are our better strategies we have for addressing some of those barriers that folk come near the top. So spending time on that. We're spending more time, I think, going beyond what is the benefit of manure from an agronomic or soil health, beginning to recognize that people have that appreciation already. And I think now we're looking at, we need to be visiting with folks about, what is the economic value of one field's going to get from manure versus another, and how can I quickly put some numbers to that so I have an appreciation of where I really would prefer to send my manure to. As our last speaker talked about, it is really, in many cases, a scarce resource, and we need to treat it that way.
Yeah. Okay. And we have another question. Do you have thoughts on resolution of the economics, especially in light of continued consolidation of the livestock industry that are concentrating rather than dispersing livestock nutrients?
Well, I'm not sure if I have a good answer to that question, maybe a couple of observations. In Nebraska, and our situation is different in various regions of the country, but in Nebraska, we're thinking instead of moving manure, 5 miles, now we're thinking of maybe we need to move it 10 or 15 or maybe 20, but we're not going huge distances. So in that light, we're finding, especially as we see these business services become available for transporting and applying manure, we can move manure fairly economically, a lot farther than we historically thought we could. But it's having access to the equipment and to the people that are capable of getting that done in a timely manner. I think that is our real challenge as opposed to dollars and cents. But every situation, there's a lot of what ifs.
Very good. Thank you very much, Rick. We're about ready to transfer over to the next talk. Oh, one more comment here. Would transporting manure by rail car rather than trucking be more economical on a larger scale? Thoughts on that one?
And that's not one I've pushed a pencil on. It's probably not one that we've had to think about in Nebraska, but in some regions of the country, they're looking at how they can concentrate nutrients and move it out of a region. I hear and see from my colleagues who deal with the poultry industry in the eastern part of the US, they may have a better answer on those kind of questions than I do.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
And we will move now to the next presentation, and this one is by Linda Schott, and it is with perceptions of manure use in cropping systems in southern Idaho.
Good morning. My name is Linda Schott, and I am an extension specialist with the University of Idaho based in Twin Falls. The title of my presentation is Perceptions of Manure Use in Cropping Systems in Southern Idaho. And that title might sound a little bit familiar, probably because there was a presentation with a very similar title right before this. And I'll explain a little bit about why my presentation is so similar in just a few minutes. So I wanted to start with a little bit of background about what I did. So I started my position in January 2019 after earning my PhD at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And my dissertation really surrounded the soil health impacts of manure and manure byproducts in various cropping systems. And that really became my passion. And I really was curious about what were producer perceptions surrounding manure and byproducts. And were there differences between crop producers and livestock producers and their advisors? And so when I started my position here, that really carried through to really trying to understand my clientele. So I started my position in Idaho and quickly came to understand all of the statistics about Idaho agriculture. So Idaho actually ranks 4th in the nation for dairy production, and that's a statistic from 2019. However, consistently, Idaho ranks in the top 3 or 4. Idaho also ranks in the top 10 for potato, barley, hay, sugar beet, corn silage, and dry bean production. That's a lot of crops. And coincidentally, almost all of that agricultural production, both dairy and crops occurs in this 8-county region that I've highlighted on the state of Idaho. This area, known as the Magic Valley, accounts for just 16% of the farms, but over 50% of the agricultural valuation for the state. And so, as the soil, nutrient, and waste management extension specialist, part of building my program is understanding my clientele. And so I really wanted to know, what are the current perceptions of dairymen, crop producers, and their advisors on the role of manure in cropping systems? What barriers exist for the movement of manure and other byproducts from dairy facilities to third-party receivers? And so I conducted a needs assessment that was based on a larger one led by Dr. Rick Kelch from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and that presentation preceded this one. I asked a total of 31 questions, although none of the respondents had to answer all 31. We used Qualtrics to kind of guide those respondents through the appropriate questions based on their previous responses. Some of the questions were slightly altered or significantly altered, and that was really to form that survey into more of a needs assessment for my program, and also make it more applicable to producers in the West, specifically to producers in Idaho. And I gave the survey to a couple of focus groups to just see how they would respond and make sure that those questions made sense to the respondents here. For example, some advisors, all advisors, were also asked what their perceptions of the challenges that their clients face to manure utilization, because I really wanted to understand, is there a disconnect between advisors and dairy and crop producers in what challenges exist to manure usage? Both online and paper versions were created and distributed to a variety of commodity lists, newsletters, in-person events in the winter and spring of 2020. Paper versions were then entered into Qualtrics and the data was analyzed. And so I'm just going to go through this a little bit. I had a total of 111 respondents that answered enough questions that were valuable. So I think there was 126 total, and a lot of them were the ones between 126 and 111, that difference, were because they'd answered no, they didn't make any sort of decisions on manure or fertility. They're not crop producers, they're not livestock producers, they're not advisors. They don't really have anything to do with it, but they did fill out the survey. And so those responses were taken out for the analysis, and that left me with 111. And as you can see, there was a nice split between crop farmers and advisors, and then each accounting for 34 and 24% respectively. There was also a large number of animal feeding operation respondents, which for here essentially means a dairyman or someone who is making decisions on a dairy. There are some beef feedlots and things like that, but the majority were dairymen who I targeted for this study. And as you can see, there's also a number of respondents that were both crop producers and dairymen, and those accounted for 19%. And then there's some others that served multiple roles, including 3% that were wearing all three hats. And so of those advisors, there were a total of 24 of them, and over half of them are in retail and technical sales. And then there's also folks that were serving in independent technical services, in positions at NRCS and the university and an extension. We also asked about respondent experience, and there was a really broad variety of that, which a little bit surprised me. So about a quarter of the respondents had less than 5 years of experience, but then there was also 21% that had over 30 years of experience, and that's a pretty wide breadth and relatively evenly distributed between those two extremes. So of those that were crop or animal livestock producers, They approximately, well, exactly 63% responded that they were annual users of manure or manure byproducts, while 18% indicated they were frequent users, and 13% indicated that they never used it. And for the advisors, those 24 individuals that served in advising roles, over half of them report that they occasionally include manure as part of their agronomic consulting, whereas 13% indicated that it was their primary focus, so they primarily recommend manure usage, and 29% said it's frequently part of their program. And so then we asked about whether or not manure and inorganic fertilizers are competing or complementary. And almost 3/4, 71%, indicated that the two products are complementary. 7% said that they were competing and manure was preferred, whereas 11% indicated that they were competing with inorganic fertilizer preferred. And 11% said that they're very independent and they don't really have anything to do with each other, and there's different situations when you would apply either one of those products. So then we asked everyone, to what degree do you consider manure to benefit or harm these cropping characteristics? And as you can see, in general, for pretty much every single, actually for every metric, well over half of the respondents indicated that manure was at least neither harmful nor beneficial. And then for the majority, over 50%, indicated that it was at least slightly beneficial. The metrics that were most beneficial, that were perceived as most beneficial, were providing crop nutrients and nutrient cycling, soil biology, soil water holding capacity, and crop yield. And those that were viewed as maybe a little bit more harmful, or at least not super beneficial, were nutrient loss off field, erosion, and soil compaction, and also water runoff. So then we asked, how knowledgeable are you of manure's impact on the following? And this question was asked to everyone. And as you can see, everyone viewed themselves as at least slightly knowledgeable. There were very few that felt like they weren't knowledgeable about these areas. And so the areas that the respondents felt that they were least knowledgeable about were erosion, nutrient loss off field, and soil crusting. And at least for erosion, water runoff, and nutrient loss off field, those areas were also the ones that manure was not necessarily viewed as favorable or beneficial. So then we asked the advisors about how they felt about their clients and how knowledgeable they were. And it actually kind of lined up about the same. In this instance, the advisors in Idaho viewed their clients as pretty knowledgeable on these subjects, while the percentages were a little bit lower on the very knowledgeable part and slightly higher on not knowledgeable or slightly knowledgeable. Overall, advisors viewed their clients pretty highly in their knowledge, with providing crop nutrients being by far the area that they felt their clients were most knowledgeable about. So then this is kind of where I separated out between advisors and those that are producing agricultural products, whether it's dairy or crops. And I looked at, it was just a ranking. It was very similar to the other study, the other survey. And this is how those agricultural producers ranked their challenges. Their number one challenge was an economic one, and it was the cost of manure transport and land application. There's also time and labor requirements for application. Weed seed introduction ranked fairly high. Timeliness of manure nutrient application, odor and air quality, application in the winter or when it's wet, flies, compaction, foreign materials in manure was a relatively big one. And then also regulatory compliance with costs. And I just want to point out before I move on to the next slide that the time and labor requirements ranked number 2 for agricultural producers. And so then when we look at the advisor's perceptions of what their clients' challenges are, it was a little bit different. So the top concern was the same. It was the cost of manure transport and land application. But the second one was odor and air quality. And that didn't rank quite as high. It was in the top 10, but it definitely wasn't number 2 for producers. Weed seed introduction was number 3 on both. And then there were quite a few agronomic concerns: unpredictability, poor uniformity, compaction, that was on the last one. Then there was timeliness, imbalance of nitrogen and phosphorus supplied by the manure, high concentration of undesirable nutrients, potential risks to food crops, and then the time and labor, which was number 2 on the other one, is now number 10. It says 8, but that's because there were some of these ranked the same. So, I mean, it's sort of 8, but also sort of 10. But I also wanted to point out that there's a lot more agronomic ones on this list for the advisors. So there's 6 of them on the one of how advisors view their clients' challenges, but there's only 3 agronomic challenges on the other one. And then I also wanted to point out that on the other 4 producers, they didn't even rank the manure application of food crops and the potential risks for that in the top 10. It just doesn't seem to be a concern. So there definitely seems to be a mismatch between advisors and what they think the challenges for their producers are versus what producers say their challenges are. And so I also asked about how do all the respondents make their decisions? And I split it out by producers and advisors. And so you can see almost everyone, a lot of the respondents indicated that their personal thoughts were how they base their decision-making process. And also they're using a network of other farmers. And that's really great. The research articles and brief science fact sheets were a little bit lower in usage, and advisors seem to use that more than producers. And very few people are using Twitter or Facebook or podcasts. And so just briefly to go through some of the conclusions, the majority of the respondents in this needs survey reported that they recognize manure as beneficial to soil health. They also indicated that they are at least somewhat knowledgeable on the impacts of manure on soil health properties. And it seems like the advisors think pretty highly of their clients, especially compared to the larger survey. And this could also be because of sample size. I only ended up with 24 advisors, and that larger study was a much larger group of respondents. Advisors also perceive the challenges that their producers face very differently than the producers identified their challenges. And this might cause bias when advising on agronomic benefits of manure. A lot of these advisors were saying that they at least occasionally recommend manure, but I wonder if these internal biases about the agronomic challenges associated with manure is what's driving them to maybe not include manure as part of their agronomic plans and recommendations for producers. And then the majority of respondents use personal thoughts and experiences for decision-making, followed by a network of producers. And this is somewhere that my program can really step in and hopefully produce some more science-based fact sheets and short articles that can help add more science to personal thoughts and experiences. And so I'll just leave this acknowledgement slide up, and thank you all for watching my presentation.
Great. Thank you, Linda. So, and you're on and unmuted. Excellent. Are there any questions? We have time for a little bit, so.
Yeah, so I just, there's one that was in the chat box of the next logical step is to hold farmer to farmer educational events with informed farmers hosting the events. And that's actually the exact next step for this. Unfortunately, with COVID, things have been a little bit derailed in terms of in-person events, but I'm really hoping by next summer to really have, I've got some advocates who talk a lot about the fertilizer value of manure, because that's kind of, I don't want to say it's a foreign concept, but here at least a lot of manure is applied to soil to just get it off of crop or off of the dairy facility and not necessarily as a fertilizer. And so just working with those advocates to change thought processes and perceptions.
So is there much of a push at all for the benefits besides just the fertilizer value on the manure? Because it has so many more benefits than just the fertilizer.
Yeah, so I have some demonstration and research projects that are looking at really just with producers on their own ground to show what some of the other benefits are in terms of infiltration, increasing organic carbon, and then hopefully organic matter. We're also doing work on soil crusting and just trying to see what other, in these soils in Idaho, what are the other benefits of soil health. And so there's a lot of work going on, and it's just now pushing out that information and really documenting it well.
Very good. Thank you. I guess it looks like we're up to 12:30. So I'm your last presenter for the day. And then we get to do our short little poll, and the CEU QR code will be posted for those that are doing that. So with that, I will start. Hello, I'm Rhonda Miller, a professor at Utah State University. Today I'll be talking about a study that we've conducted up at our Intermountain Irrigated Pasture Facility, where we're looking at incorporating grass legume mixtures into an organic dairy grazing system. Now you might wonder why we got started on this. When we look at actually the numbers, we have 3.5 million milk cows in the Western United States. And we're also seeing a huge increase in organic foods and pasture-based and organic milk production. So we're seeing more and more organic dairies in our area. And as we look at that, there's a few issues with that. Those organic dairies are required, at least in northern Utah, to graze 120 days in a year. And they're required that a minimum of 30% of their dry matter intake, on average, be obtained from that pasture during that grazing period. When you look at the actual data, though, the pasture-based dairies have some limitations. They oftentimes see a decrease, about 30% decrease in milk production for those dairies when the majority of their feed is from that pasture. And they're also observing a lot of times a big drop in the dry matter intake. Some of this is attributed to dairy cows being finicky grazers, and some may be that those forages actually aren't getting as much nitrogen as you might see in a conventional system, and therefore we aren't seeing the yields that you might normally see. In an organic system, the fertilizers that you would add to that pasture are more expensive, and so that would change where that cost-benefit ratio would be. So we had looked at adding in legumes in a previous study. This was with beef steers, not an organic system, but just as a way to reduce the fertilizer costs. And we added in 2 legumes mulch, alfalfa, and bird's foot trefoil compared to tall fescue with an inorganic fertilizer and tall fescue without any fertilizer added. Of course, the tall fescue with no fertilizer didn't fare very well. But what did surprise us was that the tall fescue with bird's foot trefoil was significantly the best combination, and we had the highest rates of gain in our beef steers in that study. Economically, both legumes were much better and much cheaper than purchasing even the inorganic fertilizer. As you put this into an organic system, adding in a legume would likely be even more beneficial. So we weren't seeing the gains that we wanted to see in this study. And so we started looking at some different grasses that have higher energy levels, higher carbohydrate or higher sugar levels, and then adding those to the bird's foot trefoil, the legume that did the best in the previous study. And we're putting this into an organic dairy grazing system. We're hoping that those legumes will improve the forage yield, reduce our fertilizer costs, and bottom line, the really important part, improve the economics for those dairy producers. We're also looking at those grass bird's foot trefoil mixtures compared to just the grass monocultures. We're looking at the livestock gains, and we want to look at the environmental impacts. So as we look at the materials and methods in more detail, we had 8 grazing treatments, 4 grass monocultures, tall fescue, meadow brome grass, high sugar orchard grass, and a high sugar perennial ryegrass. In order of carbohydrate level or energy level, tall fescue is the lowest, then meadow brome, then our orchard grass, and perennial ryegrass had the highest energy level. We also took those 4 grasses and put them in a mixture with bird's foot trefoil. To get another estimate, we added in a control of heifers in an open lot system being fed a total mixed ration. For the fertilization for the grass monocultures, we used an organic fertilizer, Chilean nitrate, and added that at the rate of 25 pounds of nitrogen per acre in April and then again in July. We also added feather meal at a rate of about 31 pounds of nitrogen per acre in the late spring or early summer. For the grass legume mixtures, we did give them a dose of Chilean nitrate at 25 pounds of nitrogen per acre in the spring and April, but no additional fertilizer. Our pastures were irrigated every 2 weeks. We're in northern Utah. We don't get much rain, and so irrigation is really essential. For the environmental portion of this study, we used just one of the 9-acre pastures in the overall study. In this 9-acre pasture, all 8 treatments were planted. Each treatment was divided into 5 paddocks, and we had either 2 to 3 Jersey heifers grazing each treatment. There were 2 Jersey heifers in 2016, 3 in 2017 and 2018. We used a rotational grazing system with each paddock being grazed for 7 days before being moved, and then each paddock was rested for 28 days. So we had a 35-day grazing cycle. And we had 3 grazing cycles or grazing events per year in each of those years. At the end of each grazing cycle, we took the heifers up to the main facility. We weighed them, we collected urine and fecal samples. We also collected some other information, hip height, blood samples, and other characteristics that we needed to get for this bigger study. For the leachate, we were using zero tension lysimeters. These are lysimeters that had been previously installed in this field. Those lysimeters are 15-inch diameter by 44-inch deep soil cores that were extracted. We then put those soil cores on a collection system, and then it had a reducer and a reservoir system down below that with PEX tubing from the very bottom of the reservoir system that was buried 5 foot below the soil surface, all the way up to a trailer where we can then put on a vacuum pump and vacuum that leachate out of that reservoir. As we put those soil cores back into the ground, we remove the top portion of that PVC pipe, and so therefore we are actually able to till and plant right over the zero tension lysimeters. That leachate was analyzed for nitrate nitrogen on a latch-up flow injection analyzer. The fecal samples were grab samples. So we collected those every 5 weeks. So at the end of each grazing event, and then those were analyzed by the combustion method for total nitrogen on an elementar combustion analyzer. Urine samples were also collected every 5 weeks at the end of each grazing cycle. And we used the tickle method for this, and the urine samples were analyzed for urea concentration on a latch-up flow injection analyzer. So when we look at the nutrient cycling, we see that the fecal nitrogen is higher in all of the mixtures than in the monocultures. This isn't really surprising. This we would kind of expect. The feedlot heifers actually had the highest fecal nitrogen content, but as we add in those legumes, we are increasing the protein content of that forage. That is more nitrogen in that. With that higher protein content comes more nitrogen. So we have more nitrogen in the whole system. So seeing more nitrogen in the feces is not surprising. When we look at the urine, the urea concentration is even higher relatively than in the mixtures than for the monocultures. Again, this isn't necessarily surprising. We've added in more nitrogen into the system. Those heifers are eating that. And when there's kind of a base amount of nitrogen that's excreted in the feces, and then as you add more and more nitrogen into their diet, the majority of that additional nitrogen is excreted in the urine. So it's not surprising that as we've added more nitrogen into their diet with those grass legume mixtures, that we are going to see more nitrogen being excreted in the urine. Now, when we get to the grazing results, though, our average daily gain was better in our grass legume mixtures than our monocultures. And we are finding that at least with the perennial ryegrass, we were right up there as the feedlot heifers that were being fed a total mixed ration. So if you'll note, both our perennial ryegrass and our orchard grass, the two that had the higher sugar contents, are the ones that produce the highest rates of gain of those grass legume mixtures. So it's looking like our adding in more energy into that forage is helping improve our rates of gain. We collected leachate every 2 weeks. We analyzed that leachate for its nitrate concentration. We measured the volume of leachate, and then we multiplied those two and we determined the total amount of nitrate lost in each collection event for each lysimeter. And then we could add up that amount of nitrate lost so that we could get a total amount of nitrate lost per lysimeter per year. So when we look at just the nitrate concentration is kind of interesting, but it doesn't tell you everything. So in this case, our meadow brome definitely had the higher average nitrate concentration, but when you look at the volume, the meadow brome had less leachate being leached. Separately, these don't tell us a whole lot, but when we put it together, we get the total amount of nitrate lost per lysimeter per year, and then we average those for the 3 years. That is really telling us what's happening in our grazing system. If you look at it, tall fescue had a very low amount of nitrate being lost. This fits with some other studies that I've done. Tall fescue is super good at utilizing and intercepting that nitrogen. The perennial ryegrass in this study exhibited the highest amount of nitrate loss. The soil here on our Lewiston farm is a sandy soil. Orchard grass was actually fairly low in this study on the sandy soil. In a previous study, it was actually quite a bit higher, but that was on a very heavy clay soil. So we are now looking at some of the rooting patterns and rooting structure to see if that helps explain some of those differences that we've seen. But the really exciting part about this graph is that if you look at it, the grass legume mixtures always had a lower amount of less nitrogen leaching than our grass monocultures. So this is even though we have more nitrogen in that grass legume system. So there's more nitrogen in the forage. So forage that's trampled and being decomposed and being recycled is adding more nitrogen into the system. There's more nitrogen being returned in the feces and more nitrogen being returned in the urine. And yet we're still seeing less nitrate leaching with the grass legume mixtures than we are in the monocultures. In summary, we're seeing higher rates of gain in the grass legume mixtures than the grass monocultures, and even better rates of gain in our grass legume mixtures where the grasses had the higher carbohydrate contents or the higher energy levels. As we added that legume, we were seeing an increased protein content in the forage, which then translated into an increased nitrogen content in the feces and an increased urea concentration in the urine. And yet, even though we're seeing that increase in that whole system in the forage, in the feces, and the urine, we're still seeing less nitrogen leaching in the grass legume mixtures than the monocultures. We can increase the nitrogen in that system, and yet we're not increasing the amount of nitrate leaching. So we're not seeing a negative environmental impact on it. We think that this may well be due to the combination of the rooting systems. Those two rooting structures can probably better cover the soil in that pasture and therefore intercept more of the nitrogen. The other component that may be influencing this is that those different rooting systems will also support different microbial populations. Those microbes also intercept nitrogen, and then as they die off, that nitrogen is released, but is being tied up for a while with the microbes and then being released more slowly. So most likely it's a combination of those two things that's impacting that. But bottom line, we can add in our legumes, we can reduce our fertilizer costs, we can improve our yields, our rates of gain, and we're not seeing a negative impact on the leaching. So grass legume mixtures, we think have some great potential. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Okay, that's the end of our presentations. I'll do questions in just a minute, but I'm going to launch a poll. And if you would please respond to the poll, and then if there's any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Good question. Is it possible that the small number of heifers in the study may skew the results? For what's coming in the leachate, maybe, although we're basing it on the forage that they were consuming. So I don't know that that's a big deal. For the urine and then fecal samples, we actually had the heifers from across all of the pastures, not just the ones that I was collecting leachate on. It's also, we've been doing this now more years, and we're seeing some of those same results. So in the tall fescue study with the beef steers, we were also getting less leachate loss than in the mixtures, the grass legume mixtures, than in the tall fescue monocultures. So I think it's actually fairly accurate, but could possibly. And let's see. Could the higher amount of nitrate leaching in the grass monoculture be explained by the additional nitrogen fertilization that happens in this system? Yes, that could be part of it. That is typically in a grass monoculture system, you do add inorganic, well, we're in an organic system, but you do try to add nitrogen because the grasses don't do well without additional nitrogen. And do we have any measurements on milk production or components? No, these are developing dairy heifers, so they're not to the milk production stage yet. And that's partially because our Lewiston facility does not have a milking facility. So trying to get truly milking cows at that point would be very difficult. And if you will please respond to the poll, and then let me get this, for those of you that want CEU credits, let me share that screen for you.